The topic for conversation for this podcast series in Breaking Bread is marriage. And with me is Kaleb Beyer. He's a clinician here at ACCFS. Thanks for being here.
It's good to be here, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Kaleb, I'm anxious to have you a part of this conversation. In fact, you approached me with this topic, and this comes a lot out of your counseling room. You see a lot of situations, and you work with a lot of couples.
Yeah, I'm looking forward just the opportunity to have this conversation about marriage, about the purposes of marriage, and begin to roll back some of these things that I think are good for us just to reflect on and to think about.
I know this from interacting with you, and I would imagine our listeners would just kind of presume it so, but this is a very passionate topic of yours. You have dedicated your life in working with marriages, which means you see a great deal of benefit in some of these points that we want to raise.
Yeah. Yes, I am, and I'm passionate about it. And I think the more I learn and experience, marriage, the more passionate I become, because I think ultimately it points to, in so many ways, about our personal relationship to Jesus. And as we think in the Bible, you go from Genesis 1 to marriage being shared and up to Revelations, the end of the Bible. So you have the first and the last chapter.
Where we have the marriage of the Lamb.
Yes.
And so we see here that this is by no accident that God is weaving this story of marriage in the longer narrative of the Bible.
Yeah. And so I think my passion for marriage comes out of not just a earthly relationship that's beautiful in itself, but what is behind that relationship, what it's designed for, what God intended it to be.
Our listeners know from previous podcasts that I've engaged in beekeeping, right? You know what, Kaleb? When I opened that box for the first time, I was a bit spellbound. Like, all of this has been going on without my notice.
Oh, yeah.
God has been so intentional in this somewhat insignificant, thing here, for His glory, and there's so much organization and so much purpose and so much intention. Okay, now let's set that aside. Marriage is that and more when we pull back the box lid, and look into it. There's a great deal of value in understanding it and looking at, whoa, look at what God is intending here.
Yeah, I love that analogy, Matt, because the awe and the worship that comes out of that experience, that ultimately leads back to the giver of all good gifts, and who we are called to worship is Him.
And I think it's so appropriate to have this conversation about marriage in particular. Some months ago, we had Amber on, and we talked about singleness.
Okay.
But I'd like to bring up a point that we made there, is that singleness and marriage are both visible testimonies of God. They are both wonderfully visible testimony. So we're not elevating marriage, are we?
No. Nope.
Above a single status.
No.
We're saying, it is important, and let's understand its wonderful visible testimony of God. If we leave some of this biblical education about marriage aside, the world has plenty of its own lessons about marriage, don't they?
Yeah, for sure. Even what are those myths? What are those beliefs that I have about marriage that are unrealistic, that is not really what marriage is about? And so even beginning to pull those and expose those beliefs.
And put your finger on some of those teachings that the world or culture or just natural man is surmising about marriage. They're clear false. And so I think maybe to put that out there for our listeners, have your antenna up for maybe some of those myths, because we will probably, I would imagine, through the conversation, bring some of those out.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think it'd be helpful.
Well, as we talk about this concept of marriage and concept of relationship, first we start with God, don't we? God is the originator of relationship. And so as we have 3 episodes for this podcast series, walk us through, just real quick, what are the 3 kind of levels of relationship are we going to peer into as we look at God as our model for this?
Sure. So the first relationship we're going to look at is just God and the world. So really, as we think about the gospel message aspects.
So we have God reaching into this broken world. And out of that love falls wonderful lessons of marriage. What's the second one then?
The second one is then God in the church. And we can think of Ephesians 5 certainly as one example of Paul walking through both Christ being the groom and then the church being the bride. And so there's pieces in that relationship that we want
to glean from.
And then the final one is God in himself. 3 in 1. What are pieces and aspects in that relationship that then we can begin to learn about this marriage union?
Let's jump right in then, talking about this relationship that God with the world. And I think, a classic verse would be John 3:16, right? Yeah. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, right? And so we see God extending love towards this world in the midst of brokenness, right? So that in a nutshell is the gospel. And what you're suggesting is there is a principle here for marriage. What is the principle then?
Yeah. The extension of that love, the extension of that grace was not based on us being lovable. That God so loved the world. And as we think through Romans 5:8, God commended this love that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And so I think one of the aspects of the extension here, or the correlation that we can bring back to marriage, is that marriage is a context by which we can live out loving someone when they're not so lovable, or receiving love when we're not.
This sets up, I think, a very important concept. I can see a departure already from this sentiment and then what is probably natural, right? Because typically when we go into marriage, we think this will fix everything, right?
Yeah.
There shouldn't be problems,
sure.
right? And maybe right at the outset, this should be perhaps a comfort to our listeners who think we're going to paint an airbrushed picture of marriage that is unattainable. That's not what we're talking about here, are we?
No, it's not. In fact, I would say what we're talking about is this whole idea of bringing hope and power through what God's original design and intent for marriage was. This is bigger than just
liking each other and agreeing with one another and making each other both perfect or whatnot.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think the whole aspect that you hit on is one of the myths, is that marriage is going to fix everything. I've had to challenge myself. There's this author who's wrote the book, Gary Thomas. What if God designed marriage to make us holy more than happy? And I think when I'm faced with the realities of living in a broken world in this relationship, that sometimes I just want my marriage to make me happy.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is this is bigger than making us.
I think we cast the vision of a very sacred purpose of marriage, okay? In the sense that in marriage we embody the elements of the gospel, so that the marriage would be a visible testimony of the gospel, make the gospel make sense in a way, right? Oh, now I understand the gospel because look at that marriage, right?
Yeah.
I look at the world and I see brokenness, and I see a God extend through that brokenness in love, and I look at that marriage and I see brokenness and I see love being extended through it.
Yeah.
Is that the right model?
Yes.
Yeah. That is a connection. And a prerequisite, Caleb, for that is to have brokenness.
Yeah. Jesus, when he talked to the Pharisee when they were together, and Mary came in and washed his feet with the tears of her face and hair, and to him that is forgiven much, loveth much. And I think one of the aspects of this, looking at marriage in this context, is that when we see that brokenness and the reality of it, then we also see and witness the unbelievable healing of this love, this grace.
Caleb, the challenging point, to boil all of that down, is my spouse drawn to me by my continual forgiveness? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to think about that some more.
I think sometimes we view marriage to be an end in itself, okay? I can remember growing up, and that was one of my hopes, was eventually getting married, having kids, having a family. But that's for me where it ended, okay? But I think this purpose moves it outside of marriage being in itself, and marriage also being part of the gospel message.
And a part of the purposes of God in proclaiming that message. Kaleb, give us a specific example, okay, to kind of bring some of the abstractness of what we've been talking about and put in an example that we can all kind of nod our head and say, boy, that sounds familiar. And then let's pull out some of the gospel components there.
Yep, sure. If we think about a transition from work to home, that's kind of a hard transition. And let's say, for example, a husband gets off of work. He had a hard day at work. He's stressed. He comes home and he walks through the door, and he has a number of young kids that meet him at the door first thing, okay? And he has a wife also that's had a hard day. But the husband, because of his stress from the day, is unable to see the need and the opportunity, right, to speak the gospel, to share love. So let's say he walks through the door.
Do you have my house wired?
No.
Yeah,
no.
I tell you what, you work with these people, and they know what you're thinking. Caleb's been psychoanalyzing my brain. Oh, stop it. Okay.
So we all can experience that. And so the husband responds in anger or a critical way or in a perhaps demeaning way. Not intending to, but it happens. It takes place.
Yeah.
And so the wife then experiences that and the coming home as very hurtful.
And that's the brokenness.
That's the brokenness.
Okay.
So from there, then certainly there's opportunities in a couple aspects to bring the gospel forth. One is for the husband later on that evening, okay, is to reflect. In the gospel message, one of the aspects we understand and recognize and appreciate is that of confession, okay? So one aspect can come through the husband recognizing, you know what, honey, I responded in a way that was inappropriate.
Yeah.
And in that point, he asks for forgiveness, right? He recognizes what he did wrong, not making excuses, but acknowledging, okay, this is something that perhaps is a pattern, perhaps it came up, but now then that's the confession part where he brings it to his wife. The other aspect certainly of that is for the wife, not in the moment, right, to bring that piece up, but perhaps later that evening or at a time that maybe they sit down and talk together to say, you know what, I noticed there's been a pattern. And just bringing up, I think one of the gospel messages is being able to speak the truth in love, not in a critical way, but being able to approach each other and share. You know what, I've noticed this kind of transition from work to home has been hard, and it's really hooked the two of us. The reality is that the truth of the behavior is addressed specifically in a loving manner, which provides opportunity, right, for grace to be extended. And I would say the wife in that manner would extend grace because in that interaction, it's easy for our buttons when we get pushed, either just completely shut down, right, not say anything, or spit out something that we regret saying. So by not spitting out in the moment, when the husband responds in that way, could be argued as an extension of grace.
And so we've seen two aspects of the gospel. One, we have the brokenness. Three, I guess. One, we have the brokenness. Two, the extension of grace by the wife. Three, the confession and repentance of the husband, which is the reception of grace. So in that episode, and if you have kids in line who have her watching this, think of what they've seen, right, of the gospel.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah. And then perhaps number 4 then being reconciliation in the sense that that embrace then happens, and then we move forward putting that behind, right, and that forgiveness.
Yeah.
You know, I think, Kaleb, we can explain what grace is, right, at a theological level. And we can write the definition on the board. We can write it in multiple choice questions, you know, and quiz people, you know, very academic. And then we can example grace much more powerfully, right? And that's what the wife did in exampling grace. There's a huge lesson to be caught in that. But I would almost contend that the greatest lesson of them all is that showing the reception of grace and what happens after to bring complete that lesson to all who are onlooking. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What a powerful sermon for the gospel.
Yeah, that it's not just that interaction, but I understand you correctly, Matt, it's the transformation or the power that comes out of that interaction that leads to, as we think of it's part of the sanctification, if you will, in the marriage relationship.
As you open the box of this marriage thing, we're like, whoa, there is way more than meets the eye here.
Yeah. Yes.
Of what God has intended this marriage to do.
Yeah. Yes. Designed by God, created by God for a purpose. And in that intimate relationship, we are completely vulnerable. Our masks are completely taken off. And we are seen as we also are in the gospel light.
Yeah.
And then as we see ourselves as we are, right, we have opportunity from that to begin to respond out and live out the gospel message within the marriage context.
And God very likely will use that marriage both to sanctify us and also to proclaim himself.
Yeah.
It's masterful.
Absolutely. And I think as we look back to one of the myths that we talked about, marriage will solve all my problems. In many aspects, are faced with our problems in a very new way.
Right. Yes. What will carry us through our problems?
Yes.
Not necessarily airbrush them out.
Yes.
Right? And doesn't that speak a little bit to the divorce problem that we have? Our culture has a divorce problem, right?
Yeah.
Because we haven't been able to navigate brokenness, right?
Yeah.
It's not a part of the marriage ideal. Something must be wrong. There's brokenness here. I'm out.
Yeah.
And God, we can see the heart of God for marriage and why he would detest divorce in that way for those reasons.
It's through better or worse. It's the agape love that as for God so loved the world, it's that committed love that then brings healing, the committed grace that brings healing in our personal lives, but also in our relationship.
Kaleb, as we draw this episode to a close, I want to give you an opportunity to kind of speak from experience of where brokenness kind of creeps into marriages. I think you've provided a wonderful example, and we've seen that gospel play out in there. But I wanted to give you another opportunity to what's another area that our antenna should be up for?
Sure. Well, if we even think about that last example that we talked through, the husband coming home from work and the wife, another aspect of brokenness can creep in just at our individual level. So whether it's the husband or the wife, but let's, for example, take the wife. It comes in the stories that we begin to tell ourselves about the situation or assumptions that we begin to make about our spouse.
So you're suggesting that perhaps what's going on in her mind in this case is she might be telling herself a story about why he is like this, why he had that interaction when he came in the door, and those stories are impactful in guiding her thinking and her response, and they may be inaccurate.
Yes. For example, let's say as he walked through the door, he approached in a critical manner, and one story may be, he just doesn't care about me, right? An absolute statement, he does not care about me, which then leads her, right, to experiencing anger, frustration, pain of feeling alone, which then, as experiencing that emotion, she responds then in a way that can perpetuate the negative interaction that occurred.
He doesn't want to be here. In fact, he probably wants to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
In fact, he probably wants to be with someone else. All of a sudden, we find ourselves in treacherous places with consequences of those thoughts that are...
Absolutely. Yeah, they lead down kind of a negative spiral, because then what happens is, in our brokenness, we begin to believe those stories, right? Which aspects of those stories may be true, but what happens is our tendency is just to believe and assume they're fully 100% true, run with them, and then we are reacting to each other's stories that then leads to escalation, leads to things being said that we don't desire or intend to say.
Right.
And
so there's a story tape playing in the husband's mind as well. Why is she responding to me that way?
For sure.
She doesn't respect me. she doesn't think that what I contribute here is whatever.
Yeah.
And off we go on our own train, and pretty soon we're miles apart with a lot of falsehood in between. And so the remedy then is, one, to recognize that I'm telling a story to myself. That story needs to be brought clear, and truth needs to be so let's talk. Is that at the end of the day, let's communicate here, and understand one another?
Absolutely. It's not that we don't bring those stories forth. It's that we recognize that we begin to add to the experience that we just had. And some of those things that we add to aren't necessarily the truth. It's probably hard not to tell stories, so it's not about not telling stories. It's about recognizing
that I am
telling stories.
It's amazing how persuasive our stories are in the moment.
Oh, yeah.
And then after the air is cleared and everything is settled, like, how did I even come up with that story?
Yeah. Research even shows that as we increase in the intensity and level of emotion, right, our judgment is narrowed. So our ability to see other perspectives in other people's stories and understand them when we're high in emotion just isn't there. Which then makes sense why when we're in the red zone, it's not a good idea to have a conversation together as a couple. It's stepping back, taking a breath, calming our own hearts, praying, and coming back together at a point that we're not in the red zone.
Well, Caleb, I think we have clearly not articulated that the purpose of marriage is perfection. And I hope that that's been somewhat of a help in casting some hope for our listeners to be realistic about marriage. But the baptized marriage in the beautiful creation of God, and that His gospel is so beautiful that He plants it in so many places, right? Yes, for the salvation of our soul, but don't miss it in the marriage also. And what we've talked about here is the marriage is a beautiful seedbed for the gospel. You can pretty well expect, if you are married, that you are going to have opportunity to walk the gospel through the extension of grace and love, to the reception of grace and love, to the reconciliation of the two, for the visual testimony of everybody who's watching.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And when we do that, we agree so much with God's love for the world and His prescription for reconciliation, right?
Yeah.
Which I think just makes marriage all that more special. I mean, I would just rather take that marriage than the marriage that the world is punting for.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. That those moments are turned into ministry rather than a place that leads to further decay and destruction or unhealthy places as individuals.
And you know what, Caleb? I think the world is asking two questions when it comes to recognizing the brokenness and the gospel. Two questions are, is it real? Is the gospel real? And does it work? It follows quickly after the first. And what an opportunity we have in marriage to show that to our children. It's real.
Yeah.
And it works. Show that to our neighbors. It's real and it works. To the world. And the marriage has a wonderful platform to do that.
Absolutely. A testimony, like we talked about earlier, that they can experience in very concrete ways that seems perhaps pie in the sky to some.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks so much. We're looking forward to furthering this conversation about the relationships of God and what we can learn from those relationships and apply them and see them and personified out in our marriages.